Our speaker for today is Dr. Rebecca Fry. Dr. Fry serves as the Carol Bremer Engel Distinguished Professor in Children's Environmental Health and Associate Chair in the Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering at the Gilling School of Global Public Health at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Fry is the founding director of the newly launched Institute for Environmental Health Solutions at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Fry's received her PhD in biology from Tulane University with a postdoc training in toxicogenomics and environmental health sciences at MIT. A primary goal of Dr. Fry's research is to increase awareness of the deleterious impacts of toxic exposures during the prenatal period, with a focus on the epigenome and developmental origins of health and disease. Before we delve into the webinar, I do want to talk a little bit about the Private Water Network. If this is your first time hearing about the Private Water Network, well, let me inform you that the network is a community of professionals that work with private wells and septic systems. So think of us as a LinkedIn for anybody that works within the space. We do have a discussion forum on our platform where you can connect with other folks that work in the same space as you do. We have a resource hub that hosts more than 400 resources on private wells and septic systems, as well as an events calendar. So there's lots of ways to connect with other folks, and that's what we hope to do. Before we dive into the webinar, I do want to gather some feedback from folks that are attending this webinar. So I have a poll, which I'm gonna go ahead and launch. All right. So the first question for the poll that you should be seeing is, are you a private water network member? So go ahead and say yes or no. And you can use the chat to let me know whether or not you're seeing the poll. Hopefully folks are seeing it. I see some responses coming in. Thank you so much. The second question is, if you did select yes, then would you like to get more involved in participating in the network through work groups, committees, and other leadership roles? So let us know if you are wanting to participate, get more involved. And the last question that we do have on the poll is, if you are wanting to get more involved, which would you be interested in participating in? We've got a couple of options. You could serve as a private water network subject matter expert. You could help out as a support administrator with the platform. You could serve on our resource development work group, or you could consider joining the Private Wells and Septic Systems Committee that is going to be hosted by Neha. Or you could serve on the PWN events work group. So I'll give folks maybe another 30 seconds to wrap up their thoughts. And respond to the poll. I see that we've got 17 of 30 people have responded. I see more responding. All right. I see that some more are responding, and I'm hesitant to close it out. I'll give it maybe 15 more seconds. Excellent. All right, I'll go ahead and close out the poll. Thank you so much for everyone that participated. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick to share some quick housekeeping items that I have for today's webinar. All right. Hope you're seeing this fine. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded. The webinar recording will be uploaded onto the PWN resource library. We do have an Ask the Expert session that is going to be taking place on our platform right after this webinar. We will be sharing resources from this presentation, as well as other resources that relate to environmental justice and its impacts on private wells. We will take questions towards the end of the presentation, so please drop any questions that you might have in the Q&A box, and we'll take those at the end. You may also use the chat box if that is more convenient for you. And at the conclusion of the webinar, you will be directed to a short evaluation. Please do take that evaluation form so we can get some feedback on how what kinds of webinars you would like to see in the future and how we can improve these opportunities for us to share with you. All right, with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you, Dr. Fry. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Making sure you can hear me and see my slides. Great. Well, thank you all for joining, and I'm looking forward to presenting the work that we've been doing that focuses on protecting populations from toxics in private drinking well water. And I am representing several groups here. One is the Institute for Environmental Health Solutions. This is a group that focuses on identifying solutions that break the link between chemicals in the environment and adverse health outcomes. Our Superfund program at UNC, which is a center that is funded by the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences. And there we're focused on protecting populations from arsenic and other toxic metals, primarily occurring through private drinking well water. Knowing that that is tied to many disease outcomes, but we emphasize in that center protecting against diabetes. And my own lab, where we focus on early life exposure to toxic substances, protecting pregnant individuals and children from the harms of toxics in the environment. I come to this research bringing and focusing on translational research model approaches. So using, for example, placental cell culture or mouse models and human populations to understand the effects of toxic substances on various outcomes. Over the years, the lab has really studied in significant ways toxic metals such as arsenic and cadmium and lead, and their effects on these various model systems. And recently we've expanded to include analyses on perfluorinated chemicals. In terms of metals, we know that these are ubiquitous in the environment. They're also toxic to multiple organ systems. They can be associated with neurodevelopmental impairment, cancers that span lung, liver, bladder, as well as other target tissues. As I had mentioned before, focused metals can be associated with diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease. So given these many adverse outcomes, finding ways to make sure that we're protecting populations from exposure is very important. I also mentioned that in my lab, we have a specific emphasis on protecting populations from exposures that can happen during pregnancy. When we look at metals, such as arsenic, cadmium, lead, and manganese, each of those can be associated with preeclampsia or lower birth weight, preterm birth, birth defects in different capacities. We also know that early life exposure can cause long-lasting harm. So that is called the developmental origins of health and disease. And one of the areas of focus in the lab is to identify mechanisms that link those chemical exposures to later life health outcomes. One of the areas of focus is the epigenome, understanding how these chemicals influence methylation at cytosines within DNA. One of the major efforts has been focusing on potential sources of toxic metals in drinking water. And I'll be talking today about the work that we are doing within North Carolina. And North Carolina is not alone in terms of toxic metals and other toxics within private drinking well water. And many of the reasons for the contamination are relevant to other states within the US as well as countries outside the US. One example of a source of toxic metals in North Carolina is the geology, the fact that several metals can be naturally occurring. Arsenic is one of those. In this map, the areas that are darker brown are areas where we have elevated levels of arsenic, and our team within the Superfund research program is pointing to that geologic source coming from a volcanic island arc dating more than 500 million years ago. So people ask in North Carolina, why might we see arsenic in private drinking well water? And one reason is because it's naturally occurring as a result of those historic formations. Toxic metals can also be industry derived. For example, we can have coal ash as a byproduct of coal burning. We have more than 15 coal power plants within North Carolina, and the byproduct of that burning is the coal ash. Those coal ash can be stored in ponds, which can leak. And we've had several, for example, one of the largest coal ash spills in the history of our country occurred in North Carolina several years ago. So February 2014, the Dan River in Eden, North Carolina, where we had 35 million gallons of coal ash that was released. And so, of course, this is another source. So these industry-derived sources of toxic metals. One of the reasons we are very concerned and focus on private drinking well water is the number of individuals in North Carolina who are getting their water source from private drinking wells. We have more than 3 million people in North Carolina on private drinking well water. We rank second of all states in terms of that number. And we know that private wells are not protected by the Safe Drinking Water Act, and that influences the potential for these toxic metals and other toxic substances to be present. Over the past many years, we have worked in partnership with our Department of Health and Human Services in North Carolina to understand the data that are being collected on private drinking well water in the state. My recent PhD graduate, Lauren Eves, authored a study where we looked at 2 decades of data from the state of private drinking well water contaminants. Lauren worked extensively on this during her dissertation and identified more than 100,000 measurements that were included. Some of the data that Lauren showed was that if we look for arsenic, which has a limit of 10 parts per billion, we found more than 2,000 of the private wells exceeded that. And the maximum that we saw was 800 parts per billion, or 10 times the EPA and World Health Organization standard. And you can see those numbers, the numbers tested over the EPA standard and then the maximum reported. So for several of these metals, these are extremely high, elevated, and established to have toxicity resulting from that exposure. So obviously something that we need to focus on and work on solutions to control and protect populations. These are some maps of North Carolina that give you a visualization of where the counties are showing elevation for these different metals. So the darker colors indicate higher levels. So for arsenic, inorganic arsenic, you're seeing this enrichment along the central part of the state. Again, that is an area known as the Carolina Slate Belt. And so a primary source for that arsenic exposure is the geology. Arsenic co-occurs with manganese, and you can see the darker blue correlates nicely with the dark red for arsenic. So we know that individuals are not exposed to single metals or even just metals, but exposed to mixtures. So something that we're working on is understanding which mixtures are present and the health effects of those mixtures. And then the green is showing you counties where lead is elevated in private drinking well water. We know from the outcome in Flint, Michigan, that public drinking water can also be contaminated with chemicals resulting from old pipes and fixtures. And universities are not alone in suffering from that. We identified last year that there was lead in the drinking water at UNC Chapel Hill, and the school worked right away to eliminate that and has now addressed the contamination across the university. We need to be thinking again about protecting vulnerable populations from exposure to these chemicals in drinking well water. And one of our most vulnerable populations obviously would be the developing fetus. Over the years, we have looked to see what are some of the health effects that are associated with toxic metal exposure that happens during pregnancy. So I'm highlighting some work by a former PhD student, Jessica Lane, just looked at cadmium levels within the placenta for a cohort from the southeastern part of the United States, and showed that there was an association with increased risk for preeclampsia. This is a disorder of pregnancy that requires delivery of the placenta to resolve and can be life-threatening for the mother and the baby. So in this case, Jess identified that for every nanogram per gram of increase of cadmium in the placenta, there was a 50% increase in odds of preeclampsia. So this is an example of a health outcome that's associated with toxic metal that can accumulate in the placenta as a result of that early life exposure. Some other work that we've done focused in the state of Durango, Mexico, where we were studying the effects of prenatal arsenic exposure on health effects. And here we identified that as arsenic exposure increased, there was a decrease in gestational age of infants. This finding has been confirmed across many populations around the world. So again, highlighting the vulnerability of the fetus to the toxic effects of these metals. Within North Carolina, we have also looked at metals and their relationship to birth defects, and work from a former PhD student, Allison Sanders, looked at arsenic, cadmium, manganese, and lead in private drinking well waters and birth defects in an elite ecologic analysis, and showed that Mothers who lived within census tracts where manganese was high had 60% increase in the odds of having a baby with a heart birth defect. We also know that, as I had mentioned, metals don't exist alone. We're not exposed to single chemicals, but mixtures, and there has been a lot of advancement in methodologies to address and study mixtures in environmental health science. We have looked at toxic metal mixtures in private drinking well water and have a study that has been submitted for publication where we show that there's increased risk for preterm birth as a result of that exposure. How could metals cause these outcomes? Various biological mechanisms are tied to their exposure and to outcome. For example, increasing inflammation, both in circulation in the maternal compartments, as well as the neonate, as well as the placenta. Disrupting hormones. Hormones are so critical for the development of the fetus. And we have shown, and others have shown, that several metals, such as arsenic, serve as hormone disruptors or endocrine disruptors. The metals can also influence the functioning of the placenta, turning genes on and off. And in terms of a mechanism that underlies this flip of the switch of gene expression, again, we've focused on epigenetic changes such as CpG methylation. Related to the major topic for today, focusing on the potential for environmental injustice related to metals exposure in drinking water. So we know that environmental racism is influencing many populations around the globe. One of the reasons for this is a strategy known as municipal underbounding, where there's intentional gerrymandering of municipal boundaries that exclude BIPOC communities to limit political participation. It's well documented in North Carolina and other southern states. As a result, these households in unincorporated communities often are not included in public water supply systems. Another reason for a disparity in protection against private well contaminants is the cost of well testing and the cost of solutions. So depending on where you live in North Carolina and the chemicals that you're interested in testing, that cost can range from $35 to $250. If we think about a tabletop water filter, which may seem like the most cost-effective way, those can range from $40 to $50 per filter, with replacement cartridges costing $50 that are needed every 6 months. If we think about incorporating a kitchen tap water filter, that could range from $100 to $200 or several $100s, again, where you have to replace the cartridges. There are other options as well that are costly, modifying the well depth, replacing the well, or using only bottled water. And so we wanted to examine whether or not we could integrate some of the data that we had generated through the assessment of chemicals in the private drinking wells in citizens of North Carolina. So working with that NC well data set that Lauren Eves had generated. And this work was led by a master's student working in the lab, Noemi Gavino Lopez, who did a fantastic job here linking data sets to identify areas where we likely have environmental injustice. So the way that Noemi did this analysis was to use the strategy that was described by the EPA for their calculation of environmental justice indices. So EPA has several environmental justice indices related to chemicals in the environment, and we use that same approach here, where the basic calculation is to take, to work in census tracts across the state to examine the number of well water tests that exceeded the EPA maximum contaminant level, to multiply that by the average percentage of the population in the tract that was low income or minority relative to the state average. And that results in the Toxic Metal Environmental Justice Index. And so what we end up with is any values that are positive, so are positive for the Toxic Metal Environmental Justice Index, are tracts where metal contamination is likely occurring in a community with environmental justice concerns. And then the negative values would be those where the contamination is not occurring in a community with environmental justice. So the index calculates this combined effect of socioeconomic disadvantage and environmental chemical exposure by combining those two values. And again, the strategy or the calculation is exactly that was used by the EPA for their environmental justice indices. So when we integrate the data from the private well records across the state and the sociodemographic information, we get, again, positive values and negative values. In these maps, each of the darker colors indicate areas where we have areas of concern for chemical exposure, but also populations that have social vulnerability. So you can see that across, several counties within North Carolina that fall along the Slate Belt, we do have some areas where we would have positive toxic metal environmental justice indices. We also have several here along the eastern part of the state. For lead, you can see that's dispersed across the counties in North Carolina, likewise for manganese, and that cadmium that's really highly distributed across the state. So how do we use these data, and how do these data inform what we're working on? Some examples of ways that we aim to work with these data is to partner with communities who are located in these areas to determine, first of all, if they're on private drinking well water, are they aware of the potential chemical exposure? Are they aware that they are responsible for testing their private drinking wells for chemicals? Do they have access to, a way to test that? Do they have resources to test? And so through the Superfund research program, we have a very strong community engagement core that helps us partner with at-risk communities that may be suffering from environmental injustice as it relates to private drinking well water. Some of this work really led us to be thinking about other ways that we can identify populations at risk. And Lauren and the team and I worked on another article that we published recently where we developed a technique called Chemical Social Stressors Integration, or abbreviated CASIT, where we could look for areas of public health concern. And the primary question was whether or not we could identify clusters of areas in North Carolina where there were high levels of metals, high social vulnerability, but also low access to resources. And so just to provide a little bit more detail, the chemical stressors that we included were arsenic, lead, manganese, the metals that we had measured within the private well records. In terms of the vulnerability or the social stressors, we incorporated measurements of socioeconomic status, household composition, disability, minority status and language, housing type, and transportation. And these are all measures that are provided through the Social Vulnerability Index of the CDC. In terms of resources, we included resource stressors, so social resources, health resources, and information resources. And then by pulling all of this information together to calculate an estimate of risk, we then looked for counties where we could identify these three, right, measurements where we would have high levels of metals, high social vulnerability, and low access to resources. So this really builds upon the Toxic Metal Environmental Justice Index to add in different layers of additional social stressors as well as resource stressors. And so what you can see here, the third cluster, cluster number 3 in our article, which is colored purple, had high levels of arsenic, lead, and manganese, low health and information resources. And so that, for example, would be access to a hospital, distance to hospital, as well as high social vulnerability. So again, one of the goals and reasons to do this is to really be able to identify areas where we can specifically work with communities at risk. The state is large and our population is large. And if we only had the data on chemical exposure, we wouldn't be necessarily identifying our populations at most risk for the harms of these chemicals. And so we can show that we can do this both at the tract level as well as the county level so that we can get higher resolution. So here you're seeing, for example, Durham County, and then we can see the tracts. So this gives us much better resolution. And so we are working with, again, our Department of Health and Human Services and several of our county health directors to figure out ways to promote health and work with these at-risk communities, whether that's providing educational material or offering to collect water samples and test them. We also provide tabletop filters for anyone who participates in our study and has metals that exceed the EPA standard. We provide free tabletop filters to those study participants. So what are some solutions? And I was touching on some of those. We developed a tool known as EnviroScan. This is a tool that integrates environmental data, sociodemographic data, environmental justice indices, and health outcome data. And again, this is our launch is focused on North Carolina. We work with at-risk communities. Again, the community engagement core of Superfund is really the driver here. That's directed by Kathleen Gray, and with key participation and leadership of Andrew George as well. We've worked with several counties in North Carolina, most recently Union County, which is one that would be right around this area in the purple, shown with the casset coloring. And again, we provide a report back to the communities describing the information that they're getting from their private well tests. And for anyone who exceeds an EPA standard, they're provided with a filter. So we have a published study on the way that we manage that community engagement activity in Stokes County. Stokes County is the county where we had the coal ash spill, the largest spill in the country. And we had communities reach out to us because of their concern of toxic substances in their drinking well water. And we recently did our report back in Union County. And then another way that we're working to identify and work on solutions are risk communication. And so, for example, here's a brochure that was developed in collaboration with an environmental law professor, Maria Savasta Kennedy in North Carolina, and the leadership Superfund Community Engagement Corps leadership. And then another interesting way that we can consider protecting populations from the harms of toxics is through diet. Arsenic is, again, one of the primary chemicals that we focus on in the lab. We know that arsenic can induce its toxicity by influencing methyl donors in the body. And so one of the ways that's been established through clinical trials in other countries is to provide individuals who are exposed to arsenic with increased dietary intake, for example, of folate. And so folate is a 1-carbon metabolism donor. Here, a former PhD student in the lab, Leah Clark, investigated whether a mom's having folate and vitamin B12 protected her infant from that lower birth weight effect. And she showed that the answer was yes. So not a clinical trial, but showing that if a mom had adequate and even higher levels of those 1-carbon metabolites, it was protective against the harms of arsenic. And then obviously one of the things that we're working on here, because of the known exposure potential in private drinking wells, the large number of individuals who drink from private drinking wells, and the concerns about exposure during pregnancy, is to work toward prenatal biomonitoring. And so we have several partnerships with clinicians in North Carolina, Tracy Manick, who's in obstetrics, and Heather Williams, who's in pediatrics, who are helping us to enhance screening of pregnant women and children at UNC Hospital. And I'm so pleased that we also have strong support from our representative, Pricey Harrison, who's in the North Carolina legislature for those activities. So really, to tackle this complex issue, we need to partner. We need to bring in investigators from fields like toxicology and environmental health and pediatrics, and lawyers and policymakers to try to address what is not unique to North Carolina, but certainly impacting our citizens very much. So with that, I would like to thank my lab, who makes all of this possible, and my collaborators within the Superfund Research Program. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Pride. Just as a reminder, folks, please use either the Q&A box or the chat box to drop any questions you might have. And as folks are doing that, I had a question, Dr. Price. A lot of the members of the private water network do work for public health departments. In doing some of this work, did you get a chance to collaborate with public health departments? And what was that like? How can they use some of this information that you're presenting?
Yes, well, if any of them are in North Carolina, please reach out to me and I would love to partner with you. Definitely, to have the largest impact possible, we need to work with our public health departments. And we have done that in several counties. We think about, again, increasing information. So some of the ways that they have helped us when we've been working on these studies is to get the word out about studies that we may be actively recruiting for. So getting the message out to their constituents has been really helpful. So they've been a voice for us in communicating out the work that we're doing.
Wonderful. It looks like we've got a question from Brittany. She's interested in the Why Test Your Well handout. Is it possible that you could share that with us so I could share it with the group and upload that as a resource in the Private Water Network?
Yes, I will double check that it has been all signed off on. And then if the answer is yes, definitely.
Sounds good. Thank you. Right. Any other questions? Okay, folks, maybe about another. What would you say was the most challenging part of some of the work that you've done?
Certainly wanting to do more. I feel like what's challenging is the knowledge that we have so many millions of individuals who we want to help, and not being able, being able to help, of course, many, but wanting to do more. But that is also, it's a challenge, but it also is what drives us to expand, to work in as many counties and really use these data to drive the counties that we are working in. So
Great, thank you. It looks like Brittany has another question. She's asking if there are any PFAS studies in the pipeline. Is that something you're working on?
Yeah, so less from our group, our Superfund. There is another Superfund center in North Carolina that is funded at NC State, and they actually specifically focus on perfluorinateds. And so they are collecting water samples and testing them, and that might be someone who would be of interest to present to this group, actually, so that the group could hear more about perfluorinateds. As I had mentioned, I do personally do research on perfluorinateds and their effect on pregnancies and their effects on the placenta. But right now, from the focus that we're working on related to environmental justice, I've focused more on the toxic metals, but certainly it's an area that we need to keep our eye on.
Thank you. Looks like we've got another question. The question goes, what kind of response did you get from well users regarding how they interpreted and responded to their risk?
It was variable. I will tell you that some of the most surprising responses were after I had conveyed to someone that their well water, exceeded the EPA limit for arsenic. Someone came up and hugged me, and she said the reason she was hugging me was because she finally got an answer and she trusted the source. And I think there, especially around the potential of industrial sources for contamination, there was mistrust in the communities in terms of, some of the data that they were being presented from industry sources. So those were really memorable experiences, because I was worried about telling the individual that they had contaminated water, and here they were just really grateful to have the result. And then, of course, providing them with the next steps of, what are some, as I mentioned, what are some solutions, and putting the solutions into the hands of the private well users is really important.
Well, thank you so much.